Welcome to the program. I'm Imran Khan. For a region that's seen its fair share of instability, the conflict between Israel and Iran is threatening to create unprecedented chaos. US President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire just hours after Iran launched missiles towards a US military base in Qatar. A ceasefire that's now at risk of falling apart. Trump urged Israel to calm down and demanded both sides do more to stick to the truce. But will it hold? And where does Iran go from here? And is there a new balance of power in the Middle East? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
US President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. After nearly 2 weeks of bombardment, which began with a surprise Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. Trump's first statement said the ceasefire would be staggered over 24 hours, with Iran stopping first and Israel following in 12 hours. But within hours of the ceasefire taking effect, Trump accused both sides of violating the truce.
I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning. We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. Do you understand that?
Late on Monday, Iran fired ballistic missiles towards a US airbase in Qatar. Tehran had given Qatar prior warning, and the country's air defense system intercepted the missiles. Qatar says the attack was a violation of its sovereignty, but stressed the importance of maintaining good relations with its neighbor.
We always we call for diplomacy for others, but also we resort for ourselves. And basically, that will definitely have its scar on the relationship, what happened today, but I hope that by the time that everyone learns the lesson that this kind of neighborhood relationship should not be violated and should not be undermined.
President Trump says Qatar played a significant role in mediating the ceasefire with Iran, and that he spoke directly to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who confirmed Israel agreed to the president's proposal. Iran initially said it did not agree to a ceasefire, but was willing to comply.
It was the Israeli regime that started the war, not us. Mr. Arachi said there was currently no agreement on a ceasefire or a halt to operations. However, on the condition that the Israeli regime stops its illegal offensive against the Iranian people, we also have no intention of continuing to respond.
Iran's Supreme National Security Council has since agreed with the ceasefire, but shortly before the ceasefire came into effect, Israel bombed Tehran, and Iran hit Israel. For now, though, the region and the world are waiting to see if this fragile ceasefire will hold. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera, the Inside Story.
So when you purchase a property in Dubai, so Dubai, Ras Al Khaimah, Abu Dhabi all have different rules, but in Dubai, that's
what's happening now, guys.
Story.
Let's bring in our guests in Tokyo. Danya Thafer, Executive Director at the Gulf International Forum. In Washington, D.C., Doug Bando, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and former Special Assistant to US President Ronald Reagan. And in London, Elie Jeremiah, Deputy Head of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with Danya in Tokyo. Before we get into what's happened over the last few hours and ceasefire or not ceasefire and everything of that nature, can we just talk through how much of an extraordinary feat of diplomacy this has been for the Gulf countries and for Qatar in particular to get to this stage? Qatar really did cash in its diplomacy chips with both the US and Iran. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
Yes, I mean, Qatar paid a very high price this time around during its mediation, but it was a home run from the Qatari perspective. This war particularly had very high stakes for the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the region, and arguably the West as well. So the Qataris, of course, are very happy about the success. And I think what makes them unique is, as always, they have an open engagement and open door policy with all parties, even if they're rivals with one another. They host the Al Udeid base for the U.S. They share a gas field with Iran. And, you know, they have been back and forth mediating between Hamas and Israel. And so they have a lot of experience engaging with Israel as well. And I think that put them in a very unique position to engage all three parties. And also what makes them unique is the fact that they were caught in the crossfires, which I think gave them a little bit more leverage with all the parties, since I think from the Qatari view that they paid a higher price in terms of being a party that was not really actively involved in the conflict.
Ellie, it's often been said that the old Arab capitals of the Arab world, Baghdad, Damascus, Tehran, have fallen, and the new capitals are the ones in the Gulf, Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. Is that now what we are seeing play out in almost real time? That the Gulf is now taking the lead in Middle East negotiations?
I think specifically with President Trump and his administration, the GCC countries have a huge privileged access, they have huge influence, and they should be rightly, as Qatar has done, using that to safeguard stability in the Middle East. And I think the crisis point we have seen between Israel and Iran over the last 12 days is a reflection that instability in a country of 90 million that is Iran, and given its scale, will be a direct security threat for the Arab Gulf monarchies as well, which is why we have seen such widespread, unprecedented, I would say, condemnation of the Israeli action, and also accelerating all levers to actually de-escalate the tensions and ensure that a broader conflict between the US and Iran does not succeed.
Let's bring in Doug Bandar here. Doug, let's talk about Donald Trump specifically. An incredibly frustrated press conference this afternoon. An F-bomb that was dropped, at least it was an F-bomb and not an actual bomb. But here's the deal. There is clearly some frustration with Israel right now. That's playing out in real time. Do you think that's the case?
Well, Donald Trump, I don't think really likes Benjamin Netanyahu. For domestic political purposes, he has been extraordinarily pro-Israel. But there's a lot of evidence that he's not that enthused about Netanyahu, that he recognizes Netanyahu, is quite willing to use Trump and the United States for Israel's benefit. And Trump also has a sense about him that everyone is supposed to do what he says. And Benjamin Netanyahu is not somebody who's inclined to give that kind of deference even to President Donald Trump. And Trump then finds that frustrating. We found that in his dealings with Ukraine and Russia, where he's been frustrated with both Zelensky and Putin because they did not do what he seemed to expect them to do. I think we see that with Israel as well.
Ellie, when we are talking about Israel, we are often talking about the relationship between Israel and America, and now we're talking about the relationship between Israel, America, and Iran. But Israel has always been seen as the kind of the wild card, the one country you can't really predict will do next. Is that something that really complicates not just the Gulf countries' relations within the region, but within themselves as well? Israel is simply an outlier.
Back in the day, several years ago, we used to talk about the fear that Iran controls several Arab capitals. And I think now, over the years, the fear has actually shifted to Israel being the chief destabilizer in the region, who is now actively undermining a new government inside Syria through its continued bombing. It is actively undermining a new government in Lebanon that is trying to to have a very delicate discussion with Hezbollah about the future of Lebanese politics, and it is now actively destabilizing the Iranian state through the choice of, let's say, the targets that we've seen over this 12-day conflict. So I think there is a shift in mood amongst the region, including, by the way, in Turkey, that is very concerned about how Israel is behaving, and the fact that there is seemingly no red lines on Israel's military ambitions, no red lines in its freedom of navigation over the skies of the Middle East. And there is growing worry that if Israel is allowed to continue unchecked, that these other countries will be next to have their own sovereignty impacted by Israeli behavior.
Doug Bando, what do you make of that? What do you make of that assessment from Ellie?
Well, I think that's essentially correct. Going back to George W. Bush, you could assume that Israel will be aggressive to defend what it views its interest to be, and the United States would almost certainly back it up, no matter what it did. And I think what we see today is that has been doubled or tripled. And I think in very much the Netanyahu government, I think in part because of his political situation, part of it's the coalition partners, but that Israel has become extraordinarily aggressive. And what it has proved is it doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democratic administration in Washington, that it will put essentially no roadblocks in Israel's way, no limits on weapons provided, and no limits on diplomatic and political support, which results in what Ellie described, is a country that has military dominance and is willing to use that to destabilize its neighbors and toward an ultimate end that none of us are quite certain what it is.
To the news,
Doug, let me come to you first with a question. This ceasefire is going to lead to, at some point, direct talks between Iran and the US. What's the US going to be looking for? What's the pressure points it's going to put on Iran?
Well, to some degree, we could look back to Donald Trump's famous tweet, or whatever he calls his posts on Truth Social, of unconditional surrender. The question is, what leverage does Iran have? Iran's leverage was the potential of nuclear weapons. It was an active nuclear, energy program. How much of that survives? It's hard to know. Trump has said that he's obliterated it. There are others who say, in fact, the U.S. has not. But will he give sanctions relief? What will he ask in return? And what will the Iranians want? The problem is they hate to go in essentially looking like they've surrendered.
My live. You didn't message me after my live.
So what can they ask for in a negotiation with a country that just bombed them? And though the president acts like he's now some independent, objective, negotiator, the U.S. conducted an act of war against Iran. This will be a very strange negotiation, and Iran is going to be in a very difficult position.
Relationships are built on time and trust.
You read that message? I did not read you because if I finish my live, I can't see any message. You must message me after my live.
Do you think
after
actually
I
the
stop
US
my
is just
live.
going to
I
dictate
did not
terms
check.
to Iran because it feels that Iran's on the back foot?
Well, I think it would be a grave mistake for the U.S. Negotiating team, if there is follow-up diplomacy with Tehran, to go in with that kind of an attitude, because the simple fact is the reason why Israel started this war with Iran, the reason why the U.S. was dragged into this war, was because of a shifting of goalposts from the U.S. from a statement or let's say a conviction that Iran could never have nuclear weapons, i.e. that it could still be allowed to have a civil nuclear program, to increasingly this concept of zero enrichment and dismantling Iran's nuclear program. And it seems that Iran, if it wasn't going to capitulate at the negotiating table, it would capitulate through the use of force. And I think this is a significant misreading of how the psyche within the current Iranian establishment works. If anything, my sense is that in follow-up diplomacy, at least the first round, the Iranians will come in with a much more hardened stance to show that they're coming in from not a position of weakness or one that they will surrender. So I estimate that the first or second round of these exchanges will be very, very difficult if they do push through. They will be, though, through, if they keep the momentum, I do think there is a way to thread the needle to allow for the US to come out with a deal that gives President Trump a win, and also the Iranians to have a face-saving way out of this. But for that to work, President Trump needs to change his language surrounding these negotiations, and he needs to give his negotiators more wiggle room in terms of what is going to be the end state of these talks. But I'll end with one thing. In my view, what is going to be very critical from Tehran's perspective is whether President Trump has the ability and the willingness to ensure that the ceasefire between Israel and Iran is a sustainable one, at least at a minimum throughout negotiations. And if Iran sees that Israel can, at its own accord, come in and basically infringe on Iranian airspace again in the way we've seen the last 12 days, it will essentially conclude that there is no point making a deal with the United States that gives away what remains of Iran's nuclear capacity, potentially other things if the talks broaden, because Israel is insistent on keeping Iran as a weak nation state, one that is removed from the equation of, let's say, regional power balance. And for that reason, I don't think the Iranians will then negotiate going forward with the Americans. So testing the ceasefire is going to be absolutely critical.
Doug, testing the ceasefire is going to be absolutely critical. Israel is going to be looking for flaws in this ceasefire because that's what Israel does. It puts its security and its defense first, and it's always done that. But Donald Trump's got a challenge on his hands in order to get the ceasefire to hold and then go into these very complex negotiations. Has he got the patience for these kinds of complex negotiations? Donald Trump seems to be a man that looks at the world in pretty black and white ways.
Well, no, that's right. There's no nuance when it comes to Donald Trump. And I think he believes he's won, and he's going to have a certain set of views that he believes of what Iran should want and should do. And on the Israeli side, no president, until you go back to George H.W. Bush, has been willing to challenge Israel and willing to put limits on its behavior. I just don't expect Donald Trump to be the first one. That he went into this war willingly, and I just don't, I think it's hard to imagine a successful negotiation. And I think for the reasons that were indicated, that from an Iranian standpoint, going into the negotiation with the kind of demands that seem likely from Washington would require them to effectively admit surrender and agree to a diktat from Washington. I'm very skeptical that Donald Trump is going to give his negotiators more running room. And who are those negotiators going to be? Marco Rubio? You know, these are not people who in the past have shown the slightest nuance in dealing with Iran, dealing with nuclear issues and Israel. So I'm rather pessimistic about where this comes out, especially given Benjamin Netanyahu's incentive to undermine the negotiations. He wants a very weak Iran. He wants regime change in Iran. The last thing he wants is a reasonable agreement between the United States and Iran.
Well, let's not forget that there was an agreement between the United States and Iran that was holding, negotiated under Obama, and it was ripped up by Donald Trump. It was then subsequently not put back in place by Joe Biden, and here we are now. Ellie, a lot of the big issues have already been negotiated. It's not like they're reinventing the wheel again, but here we are talking about a reset, starting from zero and having complete negotiations again. That seems to be diplomacy going backwards, surely.
I mean, look, a number of us warned President Trump in his first term against exiting from the 2015 nuclear deal precisely because it had taken over a decade of negotiations to find the right combination within that Rubik's Cube to make everyone content. I wouldn't say happy, but content that this was going to be a managed set of security threats from Iran. Now, we are where we are today. For those of us who work on diplomacy, we have to find ways out. But it does seem that if President Trump wants a deal, it's going to be much more difficult today after these Israeli bombings, in my view, compared to prior to this, because right now we have Iran on the ground, which has severely, for various reasons, including national security reasons, given the Israeli bombings, severely restricted the access of international monitors on its nuclear sites. We have an Iran that is very disgruntled and angry at Israel and also the United States. We have an Iran that has even less trust than it ever has done that they can get a deal done with Trump, because they feel that the several rounds of negotiations that they had with Witkoff was essentially a disguise for an inevitable Israeli military action. And importantly, on a sort of technical level, yes, Iran's nuclear facilities have been bombed. They have been degraded. We don't know the extent of them yet. But the big question mark right now is where Iran's large quantity of highly enriched uranium stockpile is, and to what extent Iran is willing to provide basically international monitoring and verification of the whereabouts so they can account for that. And this will be used as a major bargaining chip when it comes to negotiations with the United States going forward. So in some ways, the set of facts that we're dealing with are going to be much more complicated, and to restore the baseline knowledge of international inspectors of what has happened on the ground in Iran in the last 12 days of war is going to be...
Sorry, we are running out of time, and I want to go back to our other guests as well. We seem to have got Dania back. Dania, we're talking about diplomacy and the fact that there was a deal between Iran and the US. That deal got ripped up, and now there's potential to renegotiate, but a lot of the situation has changed now. What Donald Trump said at the time when he ripped up the JCPOA, the Iran deal, as it was called, is that Iran was sticking to the letter of the deal. Its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and that's what angered Donald Trump. Those have been defeated effectively by Israel. They've gone away. So is that going to have an impact, do you think, on the US-Iran?
We're joined now by Bushra Hoffman, who is the General Surgeon on a volunteer mission with the Palestinian Australian New Zealand Medical Association. She joins us from Gaza City as well. Thank you so much for being with us here. Now, we keep hearing that the healthcare system is overstretched and barely functioning there, but can you just explain what that actually looks like? Just talk us through what an average day is there now.
Thank you so much for having me on. I mean, I think there's a vast difference that I've noticed between when I was last here in December and January and then now back here again. I mean, we're talking about healthcare workers and medical staff that have been stretched thin beyond the endurance and limits of what any human should be able to suffer through. We're talking about operating theatres throughout all of the different hospitals in the Strip, working 19, 20, even 24 hours a day constantly, dealing with the injuries and the fatalities, especially from these so-called aid distribution sites where Israel is either firing or bombing people who have been forcibly starved and have gone to get food. It means that people are beyond burnt out. Staff are not only trying to come to work to be able to provide a service to the local population, we've had staff members had to unscrub from operations because their family members have been brought in as injured. We've had people had to unscrub because family members have been brought in as killed or murdered. It means that when we need certain supplies in urgent situations, they're not available. So whether that be gloves, sutures, staplers, packs,
no job,
simple things that should be readily available in any other part of the world, really limit your ability to provide care for patients here. And it also means that the scale of attacks that are happening, not just from the bombings, but also from quadcopter shots, as well as these aid distribution sites, is that there's no capacity to provide people with not even optimal treatment. I would say it's all suboptimal. We're transferring patients out to all the different facilities. There's hundreds of patients coming in. They're lying on the floor, they're in the corridors, they're outside in the courtyards. It's very, very difficult to be able to treat and assess them effectively.
And you,
and then also what's happening is that patients will either die waiting to get into the operating theatres, or will die from their fatalities because of the limited ability to give them good health care.
You touched on this, and there's really been so much focus on what is happening at the aid distribution sites. Can you just tell us what sort of injuries people are suffering there, and how people are being killed? Because there have been accusations of people actually being assassinated while they wait for aid.
Clothes. Okay, good.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very bewildering to me that we can stand by and the world can watch this go on, where a population has now gone into their 4th month of being forcibly starved without having food and other aid brought in, and then a so-called aid distribution site is put in place. People are having to go out at sometimes 1 or 2 a.m. with limited time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, to be able to try to fight for whatever aid they can get to. And what's happening is there's a state of chaos because of how desperate people are, but we're seeing gunshot wounds either to the brain, to the chest. We're seeing young kids that have also had to go out to try to get food for their families. They're also coming in with either explosive injuries. We're talking about shrapnel injuries that are either piercing the spinal cords and making people paraplegic, rupturing eye globes. We had a 13-year-old boy the other day who'd had shrapnel injury through his brain, tore through his right eye, pierced through his heart, and shattered his intestines. And, you know, like, I'll never forget the wailing of the father saying goodbye to his son who passed away on the operating table. We're seeing really horrific injuries in the emergency department, with gunshots coming in through the front of the face and going back, you know, either through the back of the mouth or through the throat or the spinal cord again, and plenty of severely life-threatening abdominal injuries as well. In the clamour of all of the chaos, people are sometimes getting run over by either the cars or the trucks that are there. So we're seeing limbs that are mangled and shattered. Just really horrific injuries. And on top of all of that, you've still got bombs going off, or you've got quadcopters firing at people. And again, you know, I'd reiterate that the worlds like this go on for way too long, and I can't understand how the world has sat by watching this population endure these attacks by Israel.
With seemingly so little action to try and do anything about it. Obviously, malnutrition, we know, is a growing problem and a spreading problem. We're even getting reports of people eating ground-up animal feed just to survive. Can you explain the lengths that people are going to?
Thank you for joining.
It really is right across the Gaza Strip, isn't it?
Kids that are basically sticks and bones patients who, once again, have no amount of fat on them to be able to heal from any of their wounds or their injuries, including our colleagues. So whether that be healthcare workers, journalists, people who are baking bread out on the streets. I mean, everyone's lost anywhere between 10 to 25 kilos over the last 3 months. Coffee is being made by Suntown is grinding up chickpeas,